All right, I'm here with Representative Louie Gohmert at the Young America's Foundation conference, where I think he's about to speak, and I thought I would ask him some questions about energy issues. So, Representative Gohmert, welcome.
Well, it's great to be with you, Alex. Thank you.
So, the first thing I want to talk about is we're in Texas now. So, I live in California. So, in California, you expect
That's the first step. You knew where we were. That's
Yeah.
a big step.
yeah, well, yeah, I'm gonna
There's a
try to
lot
be
of-
even brighter
A
than
lot
that.
of common sense here where we are. You get to Washington, it's called sense because it's not common. Here, it's common.
Nice. So in California, we're sort of used to blackouts and shortages, but in Texas, you're starting to have it. And it's not just the winter storm. You're seeing it in the summer where you have shortages even in June. Sort of, what's your take on that? And as a Texan, how does that feel?
Texans were outraged because we have our own grid here in Texas. And it's a bit like banks in the 70s and 80s. The nation wanted Texas banks to be able to be owned by other states' banks, but we had a constitutional provision in Texas that said banks in Texas could not be owned by entities outside of Texas. Well, they passed a constitutional amendment, and then banks outside Texas came in and swallowed them up. The general feeling in Texas is we're better off having our own grid. I mean, you look at the resources we have here, and of course you're quite familiar with natural resources, but we even have coal, but we have natural gas. We have tremendous amount of natural gas. East Texas, where I live, where originally it was oil production, now the biggest source of oil is out West Texas, South Texas. So we've got oil, we've got nuclear, we've got just, of course, wind and hydroelectric. We got all of the above. We ought to be pretty self-sustaining. So when we ran into problems, people were going, what is the deal? And it wasn't just, oh, gee, we had problems with solar and wind. They kept, the people in charge were encouraging solar and wind to be more environmentally friendly, even though when you produce those big bird chopping windmills, it's not all that environmentally friendly to produce them. When you're producing solar cells, that's not really all that environmentally friendly, but we have all of that. But ERCOT, that oversees our energy, they had been encouraging more of the so-called green energy. And they had already had a report saying you got to winterize your production of energy, and they did not winterize. They were still pushing and going for the green energy. So when we had this massive freeze, it even froze up a natural gas flow. So it was terribly mismanaged. And then a lot of us started finding out, holy cow, you have got a bunch of the most important positions on ERCOT that oversees our electric grid from outside of Texas. They're not even where the grid is. Why would you do that? And so there's a lot of people concerned that there were powers in Texas that were trying to do like was done with the banks and incorporate our grid into the rest of the country. Well, people have awakened, and people have been, well, they actually resigned from the board, but hopefully the board is moving in the right direction. But their whole job, they don't produce a single watt of electricity. They're just supposed to oversee and supervise. They have been terrible. I would be all for getting rid of ERCOT altogether and just letting the Public Utilities Commission here take over.
So one thing you mentioned, the winterization issue, And you think about, okay, that has to be funded. And yet Texas has spent tens of billions of dollars on these so-called renewables, which
Yeah.
I call unreliables because I think it's a little bit more accurate.
And throw duplication in there, because to have the so-called unreliable renewables, you have to double your transmission lines. You can't just have lines out to solar or to windmills. You also have to have the same transmission lines coming to something from some reliable production like natural gas or coal or nuclear, those kind of things. So you really increase significantly the cost because you're duplicating so much.
So, looking at ERCOT's plans and Texas's plans going forward, they're still doubling down, tripling down on unreliables. You look, they have very few plans. I mean, they're shutting down coal. They're doing nothing about nuclear, very little natural gas, which is mostly just backing up the unreliables. What can we do to encourage Texas to change? Because as a Californian, I would like Texas to be an example instead of a fellow incompetent.
Yeah, and that winter storm this year was really a wake-up call to Texas. We thought we were that example. We didn't know we had leaders from out of state that were running our grid into the ground, basically. So, and I'm sure they know a lot about energy, but they sure didn't know what they were doing here. So I think we've got to get back to basics. What works, what doesn't. We need to be the example, exactly like you said, Alex. We need to show this is how it can be done. And for heaven's sake, if we went to just natural gas, yes, it's a form of fossil fuel, but it cleans up the environment if we're using natural gas instead of some of these other things. So I'm hoping we'll get back to being an example. And well, I mean, you look at Tesla, the huge subsidies that we provide rich people for buying electric cars, because I keep hearing from people, well, I'm a working guy, I can't afford an electric vehicle. So we provide massive federal subsidies to get people to keep something like Tesla going, making money.
And that's, you look, it's very timely. Like yesterday's mandate, Biden is announcing a mandate for 50% EVs, which right now it's 2%, even with the subsidies, because it's so non-cost effective for the average person. And then think about that. We have the mandate of the EVs plus mandating unreliable electricity. We're at 10% solar and wind right now nationwide.
And we're putting off a real problem with those big battery disposals. Where if everybody goes to electricity, those aren't just little bitty car batteries. We're going to have massive problems dealing with those big batteries.
Yeah, I guess on the grid level, I just don't think the batteries exist. I mean, there are disposal problems. So what do you think about, like, we have?
I was talking about cars.
Oh yeah, definitely. So we're mandating EVs, and yet we can't even keep the grid running with 10% solar and wind. And the clean energy standard they're talking about means at least 50%. What do you think of that, and what can we do to stop it?
Well, it's not going to be stopped with a Democratic majority in the House and Senate, that's for sure. So people have got to wake up. I was at a meeting in Germany in recent years, met with the Minister of Energy and Commerce, and they were bragging about, oh, gee, look at how much green energy we're using. And the German that was driving the van, he had come in for that meeting just to watch. He said, they stand there and brag, I've got 3 jobs now just to pay my electric bill. They have run up my costs over 3 times more. We can't afford it. That's why I've got a 3rd job now. So yeah, think about how wonderful that is to the serfs, the peasants, as they're being treated by those intelligentsia who really become more of the bourgeois of Europe, because they condescend, demand all these payments for energy, they shouldn't have to pay that much. You can do it cleaner, more efficiently, and not force people into living lives as indentured servants.
I'm glad you're pointing that out, because I think there's no attention paid toward the suffering of the average person in Germany who's paying 3 times what we pay for electricity, and even our rates are going up. And you just think about what that means to a family. And then you're saying, oh, let's mandate an EV as well.
Well, and let me say, when I was talking about Democrats, John Dingell was chairman of Energy and Commerce Committee back in 2007 when Democrats took the majority back. And one of the things that Pelosi was adamant, there were 2 things she wanted passed out of that committee over which they had jurisdiction. One was an Obamacare, more socialized medicine. And John Dingell had wanted to do something like that. He had believed in that. I understood maybe his father did too. So he was excited about that. But there was a bill called Cap and Trade, which was going to create this carbon tax. And, I disagree with John on some number of issues, but I knew his heart. He cared deeply about poor people and trying not to make their lives more oppressive. And he commented that, look, that cap and trade, it's not only a tax, it's a great big tax. And he had talked about how that's really a tax on the people that can least afford it. Running up the cost of energy like we're talking about, it's inconvenient if you're wealthy. Yeah, I'd rather not pay them. But for the poor, for people on a fixed income, our seniors, for people that are working at the bottom of the wage scale, it is devastating to their lives. It is really devastating. Well, Pelosi fired him as chairman of that committee. She was so offended that he said, that's not only a tax, it's a great big tax, and really on the people who can least afford it. She fired him as chairman of that committee. But it doesn't change the fact that he was exactly right. It's a great big tax, and it's on the people that can least afford it.
The one other angle that strikes me is for workers. You think about all the opportunities that have come up because of cheap natural gas, and what happens if that just, because I think of it as energy is the industry that powers every other industry. And so the cost of energy goes up, the cost of industry goes up.
Well, and at a time when we're running up the deficit in record amounts, we haven't run up the deficit this much in 1 year, and they've already run and set records for a year's increase just in 6 months. I mean, this is insanity. That creates inflation, and we're already seeing that. But then you jack up the cost of energy, like you're saying, Alex, as you well know. There is not much of anything that isn't impacted by the price of transportation going up. And whether it's an electric vehicle, whether it's gas, diesel, natural gas, those prices go up, then every single product that's not homegrown is going to go way up too. And then with deficit spending like that, on top of running up the price of energy, you're looking at really creating very oppressive and depression creating conditions for people that aren't wealthy.
Great comments. Thanks so much for talking to me today. It was great to meet you. And I hope you read The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels.
I certainly will. And I appreciate all the work you've done in researching that.
All right. Good to meet you.
Thanks, Alex.